In the winter of 1654, the Iroquois Confederacy sent its armies westward and fell on the Erie Nation with a thoroughness that had not been applied to any previous campaign along those shores. The Erie had occupied the southern rim of the lake that carries their name for as long as their own oral memory could account for. Their villages ran from the Niagara River westward along the water's edge toward the Cuyahoga Delta and beyond, a people whose relationship to that shoreline had accumulated across enough generations that its particular light and weather and seasonal rhythm had long since ceased to be a subject of notice and become simply the condition of the world. The war the Iroquois brought lasted 2 years. By 1656 it was finished. The Erie, as a culturally continuous people, had ceased to exist. Those who survived the campaigns were absorbed into Iroquois communities and lost the thread of their own tradition inside a single generation. The oral record of the Erie Nation, whatever it had accumulated about that lake and the long span before European contact, went with the last elders who carried it. No account was written down. No one was left to provide one. The silence that followed was not the silence of a place where nothing had happened. It was the silence of the people whose obligation it had been to remember, having been removed before anyone with a notebook could reach them. What that silence means for the physical record found along the southern shore of Lake Erie is the question that has sat beneath the official archaeology of the region for 150 years. The lake occupies the eastern end of the Great Lakes chain and is the shallowest of the 5, averaging 62 feet at the deepest run of its central basin, and considerably shallower in the western reaches, where the water spreads over a broad clay floor and the average depth drops below 25 feet. That shallowness carries a consequence the geological record makes plain. After the last ice sheet withdrew from the basin, the lake went through a series of intermediate stages, filling and receding across thousands of years, occupying the basin at substantially different levels before the water settled toward its current configuration roughly 5,000 years ago. The ancient shoreline, the beach a person standing 4,000 years before the Common Era would have recognized as the water's edge, now sits several feet below the surface Erie presents today. Campsites, hearths, sorted stone, the material trace of any occupation of that earlier shore, now lies beneath the water. That is the first category of evidence this inquiry cannot see. The second category is copper, and the copper is where the weight of this investigation settles and does not move. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The ceremonial copper documented in Ohio's mound complexes, the hammered ornaments and blades recovered from Hopewell graves in the Scioto and Miami River valleys, is real, extensively studied, and accounted for in the existing record. The subject here is what stands behind it, and what stands behind it is a volume problem that the settled account of the period has never fully engaged. The ancient mines along Lake Superior's southern shore, surveyed beginning in the 1860s by the federal geologist and archaeologist Charles Whittlesey, opened a question that the century and a half since has not closed. The mines are physical, they are still measurable and still in place. Shafts cut into solid rock by organized labor using stone tools and a method called fire setting, where workers built fires directly against the rock face and then drenched it with cold water so that the thermal shock fractured the stone and freed the copper lodged within. The technique is not obvious. It requires an understanding of how heat moves through different rock compositions and at what rate differential expansion opens fractures in a specific formation. It appears in the ancient copper workings of the Sinai and in the silver mines of Laurion in Greece, active at roughly the same period. The fire-cracked rock, the ash deposits, and the distinctive fracture signatures that fire setting produces are all physically present in the Lake Superior shafts, documented by excavation and not in dispute. Those shafts are propped with timber. Some of them show evidence of systematic drainage to keep deep pits workable through the wet season. Stone hammers were left by the tens of thousands where they had been set down, arranged as a working crew arranges things at the end of a shift rather than scattered in flight. The wood recovered from within the mine structures has been dated by radiocarbon methods to a span reaching back toward 3,000 years before the Common Era, with the most intensive activity falling between roughly 3,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, and the copper those shafts once held is gone. The estimate of the total extraction, arrived at by Whittlesea and refined by subsequent survey of the deposit's full extent, places the figure at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of native metal. Copper that existed in the ground as pure element rather than ore, requiring no smelting, ready to be worked the moment a person pried it loose. Of that figure, the North American archaeological record accounts for a fraction. The objects are real, the quantity is not. The gap between the copper the mines document as removed and the copper identifiable anywhere on the continent is not a rounding error attributable to corrosion or the limits of excavation. It is the weight of a missing industry's output, the metal left, and the only direction it could have left in volume was by water. The geography of that departure has a single answer. Lake Superior sits at the head of a connected chain. A watercraft entering the Superior Basin at its eastern end passes through the channel into Lake Huron, then reaches the Detroit River and the passage into Lake Erie. From the eastern end of Lake Erie, the Niagara connection leads to Lake Ontario, and from Lake Ontario the St. Lawrence opens as a clear water road to the Atlantic. That sequence is not speculative. It is the same route that moved trade goods and military supply for centuries after European contact, and there is no geographic reason to believe it was impassable in the period when the Superior mines were most active. Water moves weight when nothing else can. Anyone removing copper from the ground in the volumes those mine sites document had to know that and had to act on it. The route follows from the requirement. Lake Erie is not incidental to that route. It is the passage through which any copper moving from the Superior Basin toward the Atlantic had to travel. The archaeological record for the southern shore of Lake Erie, in the period between 3,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, tells a story in its shape as much as in its contents. The cultures documented in northern Ohio and the Lake Erie watershed during that window left material signatures concentrated in the river valleys running south toward the Ohio River. The immediate lakeshore tells a different pattern. Settlement evidence thins near the water in precisely the period when the Superior extraction was most intensive. Sites appear along the southern shore, but they are shallow and concentrated in specific locations rather than distributed as a resident population would produce. Fire-cracked rock in lenses too thin to represent sustained habitation. Charcoal suggesting repeated but short-duration fires. The absence of the midden depth, the accumulated domestic refuse, the worn floor surfaces, and layered storage pits that identify a place where people lived continuously across generations. What the southern Lake Erie shoreline shows in the relevant period is the material signature of a place used rather than inhabited, of people moving through rather than people building their lives in. A transit corridor produces that pattern. A settled agricultural community does not. The sites that carry the most information appear at river mouths and natural harbor formations along the southern coast, the locations a watercraft navigating a lakeshore with cargo would require, regardless of the technology involved. The mouths of the Cuyahoga and the Maumee and the smaller rivers draining the clay plain along the lake's southern edge were the only viable shelter and loading points along that coast for a vessel moving weight. At those points, and at those points specifically, the shoreline archaeology from the relevant period concentrates. The pattern follows the operational logic of organized coastal transit rather than the distributed signature of seasonal resource use. And then there is the copper itself. At those shoreline waypoints and near the river mouths that served as the natural landing places, finished objects appear in small numbers whose lead isotope ratios, when tested by the methods now routinely applied to pre-Columbian metal, trace not to any geological source within the Lake Erie drainage basin, but to the native copper deposits at Lake Superior. Artifacts carrying the Lake Superior chemical fingerprint recovered from contexts that predate the Hopewell ceremonial networks by centuries. They are few. That is part of what makes them legible as evidence. A manufacturing operation generates debris in volume. A transit corridor leaves only what was dropped in passing. The quantity fits a corridor. It does not fit a settlement. What the record does not contain is the vessels. No ancient watercraft capable of moving copper in any meaningful volume has been recovered from the Lake Erie basin. The lake has been subject to commercial fishing operations, systematic dredging, military survey, and sustained diving activity across 2 centuries of intensive use. The post-contact wreck record is extensive and well documented. The pre-contact period is a different situation entirely. Individual dugout canoes have surfaced at various points across the Great Lakes in various states of preservation, some of them dated to the early post-glacial period. They are single logs, broad and stable in calm water, capable of moving perhaps a few hundred pounds of cargo with care. A dugout canoe does not move copper at the scale the superior mines document. The logistics implied by those shafts, the drainage systems, the timber props, the coordinated supply of a workforce removing metal at depth from solid rock across centuries require an equally organized transport capacity. Moving that output requires watercraft with cargo capacity measured in tons, vessels built deliberately for the purpose by people who understood displacement, draft, and the character of freshwater in the weather Lake Erie reliably produces. No such craft has been found anywhere along the route. Not a timber, not a fastening, not a fragment of hull planking attributable to this period and this purpose. The record contains an industry of documented scale. It does not contain the means of transport. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The absence of the boats is the sharpest edge of this problem, and it requires careful engagement before its standard explanation is accepted and set aside. Wood decays. The conventional account of missing ancient watercraft in freshwater environments is that organic preservation over timescales measured in thousands of years is unreliable without specific conditions favoring burial in anoxic sediment. That argument is true as far as it goes. But the same argument applies to the timber props inside the Lake Superior mine shafts, which survived and were dated. The same argument applies to structural wood recovered from ancient freshwater contexts at comparable ages across the continent. Wood survives when the conditions are right: rapid burial, cold water, low oxygen, low biological activity, limited turbulence. Lake Erie's shallow western basin, exposed to a long fetch and subject to sustained wave action during storms, does not offer those conditions uniformly. The bottom there is disturbed material. But Lake Erie is not uniformly shallow. The eastern basin drops to more than 200 feet in its deepest sections and offers cold, low oxygen, low turbulence conditions that favor organic preservation. No focused archaeological survey has been conducted in those sections with the specific operational question of ancient cargo vessels in mind. The surveys that exist were designed for commercial, navigational, and engineering purposes. They found what those purposes required them to find. The pattern that the combined evidence traces is consistent, and its consistency points in one direction. At the Niagara Passage, the natural bottleneck through which any watercraft moving from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario had to travel, pre-contact copper objects have been recovered in near-shore contexts adjacent to the historic Portage routes that travelers used to bypass the falls after European contact. Those objects appear at the transfer points, the locations where cargo moved from water to land and back to water during transit of the Niagara obstacle. Their distribution runs along the Portage corridor, rather than radiating from any known ceremonial center of the period. A ceremonial deposit clusters around a point of spiritual significance and disperses outward from it. Objects lost or displaced during repeated cargo transfers distribute along the path of the transfer itself, concentrated at the points of loading and unloading rather than at any fixed center. At Niagara, the copper distributes along the path. A further point in the pattern is the silence of the Whittlesey culture, the latest prehistoric people documented along the southern Lake Erie shore in northern Ohio and adjacent western Pennsylvania. The Whittlesey occupied that ground between roughly 1100 and 1600 of the Common Era, the centuries immediately before European contact. Their sites contain ceramics, worked bone, and the evidence of a community adapted to that lakeshore environment. What their sites contain almost none of is copper. The near-total absence is specific. Worked copper appears in neighboring cultures of the same period. The Whittlesey are not simply a people who lacked access to the material. They are a people who occupied the southern shore of Lake Erie after the Lake Superior origin copper trade had already finished, and whose sites reflect a shoreline that had been a working transit corridor for 1,000 years before they arrived and was cold by the time they got there. Whatever had used Lake Erie as a working passage was concluded long before the historically documented cultures of the region had any chance to know it had been there at all. That kind of ending carries its own information. Cultures in collapse leave evidence of collapse. Fire horizons, abandoned food stores, unfinished construction. The Lake Superior mine sites in the period after the intensive extraction ends do not show a failed civilization. They show an operation that was concluded. The hammers were set down rather than scattered. The shafts were left stable, the timber in place, the drainage clear. Charles Whittlesey observed this in the 1860s and found it notable enough to record, "The sites had the character of a job site at the end of a working day rather than a camp after a catastrophe." The subsequent century and a half of excavation has not changed the picture in any significant way. Someone stopped arriving. The physical record raises the question of whether they stopped because the work was done or because something else ended the reason to continue. The deposit's character, an organized ending without crisis indicators at any site along the range, argues for completion rather than catastrophe. The European dimension of this investigation requires the same precision applied to its contested parts. Modern scientific analysis can identify the geological origin of copper by the ratio of lead isotopes the metal contains, a signature inherited from the specific ore body or native deposit where the copper formed. Bronze Age artifacts recovered from northern European sites spanning a period from roughly 1700 to 1200 years before the Common Era have in some analyses produced isotopic signatures that researchers have proposed as consistent with Lake Superior copper rather than the known European deposits of the period. That claim is not settled science. It has been published, contested, and argued over in the archaeological literature, and the methodological limits of isotopic analysis applied to ancient alloys are real and have been identified by serious researchers working in the field. Intellectual honesty requires naming the contest rather than eliding it. But the underlying problem the claim points to exists independently of whether the isotopic match holds to the satisfaction of every researcher who reviews it. The European Bronze Age required copper in quantities the documented European deposits of the period strained to supply. That is a real and unresolved problem in archaeometallurgy, not a fringe claim invented for a purpose. The Lake Superior mines produced copper in quantities that North America cannot absorb into its own archaeological record. The two shortfalls face each other across the same ocean in the same centuries. The contested isotopic analysis is not what creates the problem. It is what the pre-existing, unresolved problem looks like when science tries to follow the metal to wherever it went. The people who might have held any oral memory of the Lake Erie corridor were destroyed in 1656. This is not suppression in any institutional sense. Suppression requires an authority that recognized the information's value and moved to contain it. What happened to the Erie oral tradition was simpler and more final than suppression. The notebooks arrived after the carriers were gone. The Ojibwe of the Lake Superior region, whose territory sat directly on the copper country and who had watched that shore for the longest, preserved a specific account of an organized people who came for the copper, worked it with fire, carried it to the water in vessels, and departed by crossing the water from which they had come. That account was recorded in 1894 by observers working in the ordinary documentary practice of their day. It remains in the record, available, intact, and still waiting for anyone willing to follow what it says. The Erie had no equivalent moment of documentation. The people who lived on the corridor's central passage were removed before that kind of record-keeping became possible along their shore. What they had accumulated went with them. The blank where their testimony would have been is the clearest entry in this file. What remains is the physical record, and what the physical record requires of anyone willing to read it, without deciding in advance what it can say. The mines at Lake Superior extracted copper in volumes the North American archaeological record cannot account for. The Great Lakes chain provides the only practical water route from those extraction sites to the open ocean. The southern shore of Lake Erie, the corridor's central passage, carries the archaeological signature of organized transit rather than settled occupation in precisely the period when the Superior extraction was most intensive. The copper's chemical fingerprint appears along the transit route in quantities consistent with loss in passing rather than deliberate placement. The shoreline sites concentrate at the harbor points and river mouths that coastal transit would require. The corridor went cold before the last pre-contact inhabitants arrived. The ending was organized rather than catastrophic, and the vessels that must have operated the route are absent from the record entirely, not reduced or partial, but gone without a fragment. The lake is still there. The eastern basin sits deep enough and cold enough that hull timber pressed into anoxic sediment has a real chance of surviving 2,000 years. Survey data covering those depths exists in the records of the agencies that manage Erie's navigable waters. What those surveys were organized to find, they found. The question of ancient cargo vessels was not among their objectives, and has not been made one. The boats that loaded copper on the Superior shore and traveled this chain of water toward the Atlantic have not been found because the search has not been conducted in the places, or with the questions, that would find them. There is a difference between the absence of evidence and evidence of absence, and what the Lake Erie record contains is the first of those, not the second. The eastern basin has not been searched for hull remains. The surveys that covered it were not designed with that question in mind. That is a different kind of absence than the kind produced by thorough investigation that turned up nothing, and the distinction carries weight in any forensic argument that takes the word absence seriously. Count what is missing. The copper left the Superior Basin and did not arrive in the North American record. The people who occupied the corridor's central passage were removed before their memory could be written down. The vessels that moved the cargo have not been recovered from the water they traveled. 3 absences pointed in the same direction constitute an argument. That argument is that something organized and purposeful moved through Lake Erie thousands of years ago, moved it in volume sufficient to empty the largest native copper deposit on Earth, and left the continent by the water road the geography has always provided. The lake is not finished with what it knows. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.